All right. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, I should have said that once I recorded, so I'm going to say it again for the sake of people that weren't here, and I'll say it later when we get to it, but it will get PG-13 just a little bit later when we talk about the cult in Caesarea Philippi. It'll get a little bit, I'll just discuss what goes on there, and it may not be for younger audiences, so you'll pretty much know it when we get to it. It won't sneak up on you, I promise, but just wanted to be noted. I had to say it again because I just started recording, so in case anyone watches the recording, they're not quickly taken by surprise, halfway through. So we will get started. Had a few questions that were emailed to me. I figured it'd be good to answer for the class. Oh, it's only 7:02. Boy. Should we wait? Yeah. Okay. We'll go ahead. First is in Luke 9:21, Jesus tells the disciples not to tell anyone that he was God's Messiah. It seems everything Jesus said would be recognized by the Jews of his day, that he claimed to be Messiah. Do you have any insight? So basically asking, why is it that sometimes Jesus tells them to go tell everyone, sometimes he tells them tell no one. And it is confusing, but it seems sometimes that when he tells them not to tell anyone, it has to do with his death and resurrection that he has revealed to them. But when he tells them to tell people, it has to do with him wanting them to tell everyone what God has done for them. So kind of like the demon-possessed man, he says, go back and tell everyone what God has done for you. But when Peter says, you are the Messiah, son of the living God, and then he says, the Son of Man must be crucified, suffer many things, and raise again, he says, don't tell anyone, though. There's a few things to that, and will be an interesting discussion in the future. The idea of, we kind of had this idea that the Old Testament was just this description, even the prophetic books, this description of what the Messiah is going to be like, like as if Isaiah just goes, and this is what the Messiah will be. He'll do this and this and this and this, and then he'll do this and this and this, and then he goes back to other stuff. And that's not really how they were read. It was the way I've heard it described best to understand it is they were developing a messianic profile. There were some verses that were clearly about what they believed were Messiah, like Isaiah 52. Before Jesus' time, Isaiah 52, 53, they said unanimously they said that was about the Messiah. After Jesus resurrected and the church started proclaiming Jesus rose from the dead and suffered, then unanimously the Jewish people who remained, basically the rabbis who remained non-messianic and didn't believe in Jesus, started saying that has nothing to do with Messiah. So kind of the same idea as before Jesus' time, they already believed in a greater and lesser Lord in passages such as the Son of Man or stuff like that from Daniel 7, that idea. But then once the Christians came around and started saying God is 3 in 1, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the Jews went back and says, none of that. There's only one God. He's only one part, no two parts in one. So stuff like that, kind of in response to later Christian doctrine, Jewish doctrine went back. And that would be an example of the Isaiah 52, 53 stuff. But all of that to say, they developed a messianic profile for what they think the Messiah will be like. The idea that Messiah would be a Davidic king, they believed that he would be a ruler, they believed that he would, all this stuff they believed, but the idea that the Messiah would suffer and die, some believed, some didn't, but the idea that Messiah would be son of the God in flesh no one believed that. No one thought that. You wouldn't even suggest that because honestly, that's what for 1,000 years the Greeks had been saying and other religions have been saying that God would come in flesh. I mean, that's what Caesar was. He called himself the incarnate son of God. So we always, people wonder why did Jesus not march around saying, I'm the Messiah, I'm the son of God? But because that would be very Caesar-like to do that, to say, I'm the son of God in flesh. That's not, he let his followers later work that doctrine out. But he's not going to do that because, one, that would be a direct challenge to Caesar's throne, which Caesar didn't take very kindly any challenge to his throne. So I think one is that why did he not tell people he was God's Messiah, in which there's a second question that kind of answers the first. He didn't walk around saying, hey, I'm the Messiah, because it was a charged term. To say I'm the Messiah meant a whole lot more than to them than it means to us. Not more, but different. Because to them, the Messiah was in a sense, a political ruler who would overthrow Rome and set us free from our enemies. The Zealots thought it was by might. Pharisees thought it would come just through God's provision. So to walk around and say, I'm Messiah, he would have been killed a whole lot quicker than he was. That's why he's telling people, don't tell anyone, because if you tell people, Herod's going to come find me sooner than I want him to in Jerusalem. And he even tells Herod, you go tell that fox, he calls him, which is a huge insult. You go tell that fox, basically, I'll meet you in Jerusalem. You can kill me there because a prophet can't perish away from Jerusalem. So he's not walking around calling himself Messiah. One, because everyone had a different view of what that meant. Essenes thought that there would be two Messiahs. They thought there would be a Messiah who judges and then Messiah who saves. They're pretty right. Because they didn't understand the Messiah would be both priest and king. And so they said there must be two Messiahs. They were pretty right, except they got it. There was just one, and he was both priest and king. So stuff like that. Pharisees thought Messiah was one thing. Zealots thought Messiah would be a ruler. So to walk around saying Messiah, that means something, 5 different things to 5 different people groups. So yeah, everything. It's so politically influenced at that time. Also, there's not like passages in the Old Testament that just say Messiah. It's the Davidic king that's coming. What else was I going to say? Oh, but the term he did favor does help with the other question. Why would Jesus use the phrase Son of Man to describe himself and avoid Messiah? Son of Man it's a very interesting, unfortunately, Roy just joined. He was the one who asked the questions. Sorry, Roy, we're on your second question. The first one is basically what your second question answered the first, because the idea of Messiah was so different to so many different people and meant so many different things. I think if Jesus would have called himself Messiah, it meant something different than what he wanted people to hear. And so he opts for your second question, Son of Man. Son of Man is straight out of Daniel 7. And I don't know how to do this justice, but just read through Daniel 7. It's a very cool, confusing, deep, very detailed passage. And if you look at it, Luke does very interesting things with it. There's a period where the Son of Man is exalted to the throne beside the Ancient of Days. But the period where, let me find it actually. I want to do it justice, and it's very hard to do Daniel 7 justice. So it's Daniel 7. He has a vision of the Son of Man. It says, verse 9, as I looked, thrones, so multiple thrones, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Ancient of Days is the Father. His clothing was white as snow, and his hair of his head was pure like wool. That Revelation pulls that almost line for line out. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. So it's wheels, so it can move from one place to another. That's very godlike too. You're not in one place. God goes from one place to another because his throne has wheels. It's an apocalyptic image. This part's actually in Aramaic, by the way, if that interests you, instead of Hebrew. Verse 10, a stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. Revelation again picks up on that. The court sat in judgment. So he's in the midst of a court, which would have been, we'll get to that actually next week, it would have been a council of divine figures, not gods. We would call them lowercase g gods, but they had a word that was just Elohim. It wasn't angel, but it wasn't all-powerful God. We would just call them angels. So just say he's in the angels, but we'll redefine what that means next week. So he sits in the court in judgment, and the books were open. Again, Revelation. I looked, then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away. We'll get to that next week, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. That is like a summary of Revelation. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like the Son of Man. So this Son of Man is just Ben Adam, it just means human. So he's just saying someone came to heaven beside the Ancient of Days that was like the Son of Man, just a human, a person. Nothing special about this person. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. That's straight out of Ephesians or Colossians. Given dominion and a glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. And hopefully that kingdom language is charged enough for you by now to see the power in that. But basically what happens is he comes, in verse 11, the beast is defeated. He kind of goes on this tangent that the beast is defeated. Doesn't say how. But then the Son of Man comes and sits beside the Ancient of Days. And that is literally Acts 1 and 2. The whole point of Jesus ascending to the clouds of heaven is not to know where he went, but to know what story that's pulling out of. That is he's going to the clouds of heaven to show you he's going beside the Ancient of Days, which shows you if he's beside the Ancient of Days in verse 13 and down, that means the beast has been defeated. So Jesus' way to teach you the beast has been defeated, and he will be restrained for a time, burned with fire, is to show you he ascends to the clouds beside the Ancient of Days. It's a crazy cool image that Luke does with that he ascends to the clouds to show, yes, he is the Son of Man from Daniel 7, like he's been saying this whole time. It wasn't enough to say you're Messiah, because they didn't think Messiah would be the one to defeat Satan himself. They knew God would do that, but they didn't understand. So for him to walk around Jesus saying, I'm the Son of Man, I'm the Son of Man, he uses that as a title. And interestingly, that title actually doesn't stick. No one calls Jesus the Son of Man after himself calls himself the Son of Man. It's very odd. Then they go back to in the epistles calling him Christ, which is Messiah. They call him Son of God, Christ, Messiah, King, but they don't ever call him Son of Man. I think largely because Paul is taking the message of the gospel to a Gentile audience, and they would have no idea what Son of Man meant. So he says Jesus is the Son of God and King. He uses Caesar's language instead of Daniel's language in order to communicate who Jesus is. So anyway, I think that's where the Son of Man language comes in. That's who Jesus is. That's where he's pulling that phrase is straight from Daniel 7, to say that he is that figure. And when he calls himself Son of Man, sometimes people get mad, as we looked at earlier in the Luke study. And I suggested, if you weren't here, I think it's interesting. It's speculative, I know, but if there's any place to speculate, it's class and not like a sermon. This part in Daniel is in Aramaic, because they were in Babylon when it was written, and that was Babylon's language. So you say Son of Man, of course, differently in Aramaic than you in Hebrew. So I suggested maybe the reason they got so mad when he said Son of Man was because he switched mid-sentence from Hebrew to Aramaic and then back to Hebrew again. So they know he's not just saying he's a human, but he's saying he's the Son of Man from Daniel 7, which is written. I don't know, that's speculative, but I find that interesting. And then in the last question was, I read that the Jews of the time expected both Moses and Elijah to appear at the end of time. That is true during Second Temple Judaism, apocalyptic eschatological belief, ignore all those words, but in their idea of basically how the future of the world would play out, they believed before the end of times Moses and Elijah would come back. There was also another Jewish belief that Moses didn't actually die. Well, I'm not going to get into that. It's not important. I think Moses did die, but there was a kind of a theory that he didn't. And so they believe Moses and Elijah will come back. And so, of course, in this account we'll go through today, Moses and Elijah are there, which is, I think, Jesus signaling, yes, Moses died, but now he's appearing with God. And Elijah, who never died, is also appearing, so that you have a witness from both the living and the dead. So God is the God of the living and the dead. And then in Revelation, again, you have two witnesses that are unnamed and unidentified, which is, I think, John very much picking up on that Second Temple Jewish belief that there will be two prophets to return before the end of days, which would be, I don't think you're supposed to guess who it is, but I think it's just John kind of riffing off that a bit, that there will be two people. And with it, that of course you get to the rabbit hole. Is that literal? Is that real? Is it? I don't know. That would be that's a Revelation class, and this is a Luke class. But so all that to say, when Moses and Elijah appear, those are also the only two people who've gone up to Sinai and communed personally with God. Elijah when he was discouraged, and Moses, of course, in Sinai and Exodus. So I find that interesting that Jesus is met up there by the only two people to have gone up Sinai to the top and commune with God. Of course, Moses brings a few others with him and then goes to commune with God separately. So let's read through Luke 9, starting in verse 18. And we will take a big chunk out of Luke because I think this is all one big teaching. And then what we're going to do is look at different accounts, and we'll look at Matthew and what Mark do with it, and as different than what Luke does with it. And then we'll look at the culture because Luke doesn't say where they're at. As far as you're concerned, if all you had was Luke, you'd have no idea that they're anywhere but Galilee, because they didn't say anything. And then we'll look at where Matthew places them for good reason. And then we'll look at just kind of the culture there. Sure. 18 to
a little closer so I don't have to speak as loud.
18 to 50. 50.
Through 50?
Yeah, verse 18 through verse 50.
Okay. Now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he asked them, "Who do the crowd say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and others that one of the prophets of old has risen." Then he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "The Christ of God." And he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised." And he said to all, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. But I tell you truly, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God." Now about 8 days after these things, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. As he was saying these things, a cloud came over and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. And behold, a man from the crowd cried out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child." And behold, a spirit seizes him, and he suddenly cries out. It convulses him so that he foams at the mouth and shatters him and will hardly leave him. And I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon threw him to the ground and convulsed him. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the boy and gave him back to his father. And all were astonished at the majesty of God. But while they were all marveling at everything he was doing, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men." But they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them, so that they might not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying. An argument arose among them as to which of them was the greatest. But Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a child and put him by his side and said to them, "Whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For he who is least among you all is the one who is great." John answered, "Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he does not follow with us." But Jesus said to him, "Do not stop him, for the one who is not against you is for you."
Nice, thank you. I forgot to mention at the beginning something interesting I learned this week going through some rabbinic writing from Jesus' time. One of the questions was, we wear our tassels and we say Shema every morning. How early, this is completely unrelated to whatever, I just thought it was interesting. How early are we, is it okay to recite Shema? "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, Lord is our one." They say that every morning and night. And because to them, it was, they say it in the morning, okay, but what constitutes the morning? Kind of like here, it's like, well, 1 a.m. is technically 1 in the morning, but we don't call the morning. We don't, when it's 1 a.m., it's still last night, it's not in the morning. It's kind of the same thing. So one rabbi said you can recite Shema as early as you can distinguish blue from white, meaning once there's enough light to look down at your tassels and see the blue strand and tell it apart from the white strand, then it's technically morning and early enough to where you're saying Shema in the morning and not last night. I thought it was really cool. Just like they don't have clocks, so they're like, well, when do we recite Shema? It says, well, they look around whenever you can tell the tassels on your, the colors on your tassels apart. So in Luke, thank you for reading that. In Luke, we have, first of all, I think it's interesting. He says, you're going to go and you're going to see the kingdom of God come. So some of you won't taste death until you see the kingdom of God coming, which I love that. The kingdom of God to Jesus is in the heavens, but it's coming down. So he is bringing what is currently happening in heaven into the chaos of the world through his disciples. And that is like a summary of the whole gospel message, the kingdom of God coming. The way that their faith is confirmed is by seeing this kingdom of God face to face in the transfiguration. Peter in 2 Peter actually picks up on this again and reminds his hearers encouraging them not to follow false teachers. In 2 Peter 1, verse 16, he says, "For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when we received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him by the majestic glory, saying, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased,' we ourselves heard this very voice borne from heaven, for we were with him on that holy mountain. And we have the prophetic word more fully confirmed, to which you will do well to pay attention as to a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your heart, knowing first of all, that no prophecy of Scripture comes from someone's own interpretation." So Peter's recalling that moment that he saw the glory of God bestowed on Jesus and God speaking from the heavens. And then his reasoning is, don't listen to myths, listen to what we say, because he remembers that moment. He was given the keys of the kingdom to bind into loose teachings, which is an interesting topic maybe we'll get into later, but it's his authority to bind in loose teachings for the church. So I love that. So he's saying, hey, listen to me, because I saw God himself speaking to Jesus on that holy mountain. So the reason we know that this is Mount Hermon, there's a tradition. If you go to Israel now and you get a secular tour guide, you say, take me to where the transfiguration happened, they'll take you to Mount Tabor. And quite honestly, nowhere near where it probably likely happened. That way up north is where it happened by Caesarea Philippi, believe it or not, what Matthew and Mark say, because this event at Caesarea Philippi happens, and then they go to the Transfiguration on a high mountain. Well, there's one high mountain there, and it's Mount Hermon. It's huge. It has snow on the top. There's actually a ski resort there today. It's very big, very tall. And interestingly, Hermon means holy or sacred. And Peter says, when we saw on that holy mountain, on that sacred Hermon mountain. So I love that that comes through a little bit in Peter. So let's see. So what happens, and what you need to see in this most of all, and what kind of Luke is doing, because Luke doesn't really care a whole lot where you think this happened, he draws this picture of the feeding of the 5,000. Okay, we bring God brings his people out of Egypt, feeds them in the wilderness, and then Sinai. So Moses goes up Sinai and talks to God, and all the same elements from Sinai are present here. The fire on the mountain, the clouds on the mountain, the voice of God. Interestingly, Luke picks up on that again in Acts, with the voice of God in Hebrew is kol is voice, kolot is voices. It also means thunder. So on Mount Sinai is either God's thunder or God's voice. And so it may sound like thunder, may sound like voice, and that same idea kind of comes through in Acts 2 on Pentecost. So, but in Exodus, basically all these elements are present of the cloud covering Sinai, which is where you get the Jewish tradition now of the chuppah. We had at our wedding like a sheet covering, because to them Sinai was a marriage covenant, and so that was God covering them over his cloud and their protection. So if you import the image of the golden calf to that, literally at their marriage ceremony with God, they're committing adultery with other gods. I mean, imagine just that image to them, what that means to them. That's not so much that they were just worshiping while Moses was away for a long time. It's during the wedding ceremony, they were committing adultery. That's heavy, very heavy imagery. So all these Sinai images going on in the Transfiguration. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John with him. Moses takes 3 people with him up the mountain. In Exodus 24, let me go there. I think Exodus 24 will also help us solve a long-standing issue of what did Peter mean by "let us build booths for you." No one ever knows what to do with that. I didn't know what to do with it. Don't start with me, but it's like we always make him out to be this kind of, which he is portrayed as being asleep, coming awake, kind of like, what's going on? Let us make booths. What am I saying? Like he may as well said, let us make birdhouses. Like he has no idea what he's saying. I don't think that's the case. I think he's so steeped in Scripture, he knew exactly what he was saying. But in Exodus 24, Moses takes 3 people with him. He goes up, a cloud covers them. He goes up into the cloud and speaks to God about kind of just his mission and what's going to happen. And if you look in Luke it says, and he goes to, in verse 31, 9:31, 30, and behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure. Mine has a superscript, and if you look in the Greek, and they spoke to him of his exodus. It's literally the word exodus. So he goes up Sinai, imagery in Luke, speaks with God and Moses and Elijah about his exodus. that he's about to accomplish at Jerusalem, it says. So that is a thesis statement for the rest of Luke, is how is this Exodus about to be accomplished in Jerusalem? What does that look like? Because everyone thinks it's going to look like something different, and you get into Jerusalem, and we get to see what everyone thinks it looks like. So this Exodus is about to happen in Jerusalem. The voice of God, of course, it says that Jesus was transformed. Luke avoids a word there, metamorpheo, which is a word that was used in Greek cults. If you're interested, he avoids that word and uses a different word for transformed. But Paul uses that language for transformed, how we will be transformed in the twinkling of an eye with the resurrection of our body. Or if you're still alive, you'll just be transformed on the spot, evidently, what Corinthians says. So Jesus is transformed and is glowing, and that's exactly what happens to Moses. He comes down from Sinai. They make him put a veil on because his face was glowing, and they were scared to look at him, and they were scared to hear from God, so they made Moses go. An imagery of what, before we get to that, let's go to the booths thing, just to kind of clarify what that means. In Exodus 24, now, first of all, I don't know how to explain this, but in Luke, it says, now at the end of 8 days, they went up the mountain. I don't know what to do with that, because Mark and Matthew say at the end of 6 days. And I don't have an answer for you, but I'm just going to go with the 6 days because Matthew and Mark say that. And I think that is, I've heard it suggested, just a scribal error, which it very well could be. Maybe Luke has a different symbolism in his head. I don't know. But as far as Matthew and Mark saying at the end of 6 days, they go up the mountain. That's exactly what happens in Exodus 24. It says, then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain, in verse 15. Sorry. The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, tabernacled. It resided with them, abode with them. In the same image for in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and Jesus came in, tabernacled, and came and dwelt among us. I think John is pulling Sinai imagery there also. So it says the glory of the Lord came and stayed and abode and dwelt with them on Sinai, and the cloud covered Sinai for 6 days. And on the seventh day, God speaks to Moses. And so for Jesus to prove his point, he waits 6 days, and then on the seventh day goes up Mount Hermon to resemble Sinai, and has God speaks to him, or God speaks to him to show that in both cases God is speaking on the seventh day. And what happens is Moses, in verse 18, entered the cloud and went up on the mountain. Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So what's happening is Peter thinks, okay, the glory of God comes in, tabernacles and rests on Mount Sinai. Moses stayed here 40 days, 40 nights. He wakes up and realizes, okay, I know what's going on. I see Moses for some reason and Elijah. I see the glory of the Lord. We're about to be here for 40 days at least. And so Jesus, do you want us to build booths? Because I can tell we're going to be here a while. And I love that. I think it's so funny. He knows that he's so immersed in the text that half awake, he is remembering what happened in Exodus 24, how they waited 6 days. On the seventh day, God spoke, and the glory of God tabernacled on the mountain. We need to make booths because we're going to be here for 40 days. It's like literally ingrained into his subconscious to know the text. It's like, I think that's so cool. So anyway, that's what I would do with the booths. So one image that you kind of need to see in this is, which Luke does twice as far as I could tell. While they're up on Sinai, or they're up on Mount Hermon in this transfiguration, what's going on down below? And that is a huge parallel for Luke. He does it later with the ascension again. For Jesus, he ascends to go, which is another, he goes into the clouds, Sinai. So it's a double imagery of the Son of Man, but also imagery of he goes up Sinai to be with God. What's going on at the bottom while Jesus is gone? Because he says, I'm coming back, just like Moses said, hey, I'm coming back. Even if I'm delayed, don't panic. I'm coming back. So the whole imagery in Acts 2 or Acts 1 is what's going on with us while our Moses, Jesus, is on Mount Sinai. Are we worshiping a golden calf? Are we remaining faithful? Are we like Aaron? Aaron just says, I don't know, the calf just jumped out of the fire. I don't know how it was made, It's like, what's going on with us while our Moses, Jesus, is up on Sinai with God? Are we remaining faithful? And that's the imagery Luke is pulling. Earlier, Luke pulls it here in the Transfiguration when Jesus comes down from Sinai, or from Mount Hermon, the Sinai moment. He finds the crowds, and what happens is the disciples were unable to cast out a demon. So then he casts out the demon. And what he says is, oh, faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you and bear with you? That's straight out of Deuteronomy 32. Moses calls him a faithless and crooked generation. Peter picks up on that also, referring to Gentiles, calling the Gentiles, basically, don't do what the faithless and twisted generation does. That's out of Moses' song in Deuteronomy 32. Jesus cast out the demon. In verse 43, it says, but while they were all marveling at everything he was doing, Jesus said to his disciples, let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. So while all the people are marveling, he tells his disciples, hey, I know everyone's marveling right now, but these same people that are marveling are the same people who are going to deliver me to die. So don't get caught up in what they're excited about me doing. So I love that. That's kind of what's going on at the base of Sinai. But it's not just them. They're not the problem. The disciples are the problem. Then they start arguing, which one of them is the greatest? These are connected stories. They immediately start arguing, oh, okay, Jesus is going to be delivered to the hands of men. Which one of us is the greatest? Because if you're going to die, we want to be with you in your kingdom. Which one's the greatest? Or it could be whatever disciples were at the bottom couldn't cast out the demon. Maybe Peter, James, and John, who were up on the mountain, are saying, hey, we were on the mountain with them. We could have cast out if we were down here. Jesus cast it out already. So like, well, we would have been able to cast it out. Jesus then takes a child. I would not be surprised if this was the same child he just cast the demon out of, and says, whoever receives this child in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For whoever is the least among you all is the one who is great. John answered, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him. There's just so much more evidence that John is like less than 13. Because, I mean, what poor timing for, like, everyone else got the message. John is like, hey, what about that guy we tried to stop from casting out demons in your name? You know, can he join us? And when Jesus' whole message is, you know, stop thinking yourself so great. So John's like, what about the guy we prevented? So Jesus teaches them to do not stop him, for the one who is not against you is for you. And so Jesus has to come down from Sinai and battle with their pride and thinking that they are great, when his whole message is to be great means to give your life for others, which is what the Son of Man is going to do. So let's go back a little bit to while they're on the mountain. I skipped that because I want to look at Matthew and Mark's account. They say essentially the same things, but Luke leaves out Peter's confession. Not his confession, but the keys of the kingdom and Peter's rebuke of Jesus, which is interesting. Let's look real quick. So let's just go to Matthew. So I think just as a transition, Luke doesn't tell you where they're at because he doesn't. That's not in his agenda. An agenda is not a dirty word in the gospel accounts. They all have an agenda. John just tells you what his is at the end. He says, I wrote these things so that you'll believe Jesus is the Messiah. I picked these things. There's a ton of things I could have wrote. I picked these so that you'll know he's the Messiah. So John has an agenda. He just tells you. They all have an agenda. Of course, it's all in the end to show you Jesus is the Messiah. But Luke doesn't find it necessary to show you that where they're at is Caesarea Philippi. But Matthew and Mark do. So in Matthew's account, and I think Matthew 14, it says that they're at Caesarea Philippi. Matthew 17, sorry. So they're at Caesarea Philippi. And what happens is Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ. Jesus tells him, basically, you are the rock. On you I'll build my church, which we'll get to. And then Peter then rebukes Jesus for saying that the Son of Man must die, and then Jesus rebukes Peter back. So basically what happens in that is, actually, I needed the Caesarea Philippi thing first. I'm trying to get my ordering right. It says that when they came to the district of Caesarea Philippi. Now, this is probably the best example, other than like Jerusalem or the other side, of somewhere that can just become lost on you or just become a dot on the map of a place that is somewhere over there we don't really know. So what goes on at Caesarea Philippi, and this is the part, by the way, where if you have younger audiences listening, you might want to shut their ears or kick them out of the room. So Caesarea Philippi is Jesus and his disciples come here. So he brings his disciples. That's why I'm comfortable telling you it, because I think Jesus didn't want you to be sheltered from it if you're able to take it. He brings them here, and what goes on in Caesarea Philippi is worship of the demon Pan. Basically, Alexander the Great took this region, and then Herod had it later on, and he named it after Caesar. And then he called it Caesarea. Then they realized, oh wait, there's already a city called Caesarea. People will get confused, so they call it Herod Philip's Caesarea Philippi. And so that's how it got its name. But basically, when the Greeks came in, they made it the city's god, Pan, the demon. Well, we call him a demon, they just call him a god. They made it Pan, which is the shepherd's fertility god. So it was a fertility cult city, which has a lot of implications. What basically happened there was they would, the way you worship in a fertility cult is that they believed that in the spring seasons when the rain stopped, in the fall when it started, the reason it stopped in the spring there, I know it's kind of reversed here, but the reason it stops in the spring there is because the gods went to Hades. They went to the underworld. And the place where the entrance of the underworld is the springs that come out of the ground. And there are 4 springs in this area that come out of the ground. The other one is very close by called Dan's, the city of Dan. A spring comes out of the ground there, and they believe, okay, the gods give us life. Therefore, this water also clearly gives us life. So wherever the water comes out of the ground, there the gods must be. That's pretty simple logic. And so these people came, they saw, okay, these springs come out of the ground. So therefore, the gods are here. So they made it the fertility god Pan. The gods go into the underworld during the spring, and that's why it doesn't rain. And you want to bring them back out. And so when fall times come, they would have this ceremony trying to get Pan to come back. Pan was half goat, half man, bottom half goat, bottom half man, top half man, bottom half goat. And this is very odd and strange, but he had the part on him that was worshipped was his 4 to 6 long erect phallus. So it was a statue in the temple of Pan in Caesarea Philippi. Okay, no one left when I said that because that's not even half as bad as it gets. They would worship his erect phallus. And this is, the reason I'm comfortable saying this is because, one, I'm the youngest in the class, but also Jesus brings his young boy disciples here to prove a point. I love that Jesus just does not stay separate or away from these people. He moves directly to them, comes into their city, and we'll see in Mark, he yells at them. But so Pan was this half goat, half man god that they worshiped his body parts. There would be a festival once a year called Pandemonium. Pan, the name, demon, pandemonium, where people would come, and that is where we get the word both pandemonium and panic. They would come in a panic to Pandemonium and worship their fertility god Pan, because the way that you get him to come back from Hades, from the underworld, and was to get him aroused sexually, so that he would have sexual relations with Asherah, Mother Earth. So if you ever say Mother Earth, you're actually quoting some very pagan stuff. So he would come and have sexual relations with Asherah, Mother Earth, and the rain that provided life for the earth was his semen. And so the way that you arouse him was to have dancing temple priestesses called nymphs. They would dance around very sexually, and they would have this ceremony for 10 days, and for 10 days his statue would be passed around the city, and you would oil it, and you would fondle it, and you would try to get him aroused so that he would come back from Hades. And you knew he came back from Hades or he was pleased when you would sacrifice a goat. You would put it in the spring that comes out of the earth. That was actually in a cave at that time. So the spring in a cave. Actually, there's an earthquake in the 1800s, and it shifted it completely. So the water no longer comes out of the cave. Oh, I forgot I have a picture, so that is making it a whole lot more. Here we go. Yes, here we go. I think that's how you share it. So there you go. I'm sharing my screen now. This is just a Word document. This will help a whole lot. I hope you can see my cursor, but this is Mount Hermon. Okay, this is Caesarea Philippi. This little area over here is this. So that's what's going on here. Over to the right to the left is the temple to Caesar, and over all this to the right is the temple of the dancing goats. That is where all the pandemonium stuff went on, and it'll be a whole city event. This is this close up. So these little 3 niches right here are these 3, and then over here is where the water would come out. Right over here is where the water would come out. Right there is where the water would come out, but that picture is not up to date because the water came out from the temple, flowed out, and that entrance to the temple is called the gates of hell. So they called Caesarea Philippi the gates to Hades. Am I done sharing screen? Okay, just making sure. So that was the gates to Hades, was this spring where Pan would go to the underworld, to Hades. So I hope you can already import that too. And the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. You could point to they could have pointed to it. It wasn't in hell, whatever it is, that evil force in the world won't prevail. No, he's saying that is true. but he's doing that by saying, hey, and those, he brings them 32 miles north walking to the most pagan city in the region and says, hey, those won't prevail against this. And I love that teaching strategy, because you're never going to forget those 64 miles you walked plus the 8-day journey up a mountain to hear God's voice. It's so cool. So back to the Pandemonium Festival, over in those courts, they, at the end of the 10-day festival, they would bring temple priestesses out, and basically you could have your way with whatever you wanted. If male, male, female, female, male, female, whatever you wanted, you just complete sexual debauchery at that the end of the throughout the whole Pandemonium Festival. What they would also do is they would bring a bunch of female goats in heat out, and they would release a bunch of male goats around them, and they would like celebrate and have sex with each other while the goats had sex with themselves. So they would watch the goats mate, and then hopefully that would make the goat half of Pan sexually aroused, so that he would come back from the underworld and bring life to the earth. And then at the very end of the Pandemonium, the men would then go in, and they got to choose the female goat of their choosing, and then they themselves would commit bestiality with these goats. So that is a little bit of what goes on at Caesarea Philippi. That is actually not the worst one. Up north a little bit in Asia Minor, in a region Paul visits, what they would actually do, if you could work up the religious fervor, if you were a man, you would castrate yourself and donate and tithe your male body parts to the gods, to the fertility gods. And Paul picks up on that a bit in Galatians, I think, when he says, if you think circumcision is of any value now, I wish that you would emasculate yourself. He says, if you think circumcision will do anything now, you may as well be worshiping Pan. You may as well be worshiping these fertility gods, because that's how God will view it. If you think circumcision will do anything for you now, if you're a Gentile, it doesn't do anything for you. So go emasculate yourself and worship Pan if you're going to do that. That's Paul's language there. Very, very much picking up on the Artemis worship there. In that, sorry, let me get my ordering right. In that big wall, I'm going to reshare my screen. I might just leave it so y'all can see. This was called the Rock of the Gods, because in these little niches, they would have little idols of Pan and little idols of other gods. Pan was the main one. Yeah, just making sure I got everything. And so that was called the Rock of the Gods. And import that also. So Peter says, Jesus says, who do the people say I am? They say either Elijah or a prophet or John the Baptist come back from the dead. We don't know. Jesus says, who do you say I am? And Peter, being the oldest, says, you are the Messiah, son of the living God. And I find that very interesting, that because that's not something you really have to clarify, that he would be son of the living God. Son of the living God. Also, if you want those images, you can literally just Google Caesarea Philippi and they will all come up. I think what is going on here is that Jesus brings his disciples to Caesarea Philippi, which is what it says. And then he, knowing the disgust in the pagan practices and the abominable practices of the city, he asked them, now who do you say I am? And Peter says, you are the son of the living God. Unlike all of these Pan worships, you are the living God who brings life. I love that he has to emphasize the living God here. Maybe he was in the presence of people from Caesarea Philippi. I don't know, that would have heard that. Would they have? And that's a question we don't know. How close did they come? Have no idea. I think they were almost certainly within view, because that's a very rabbinic way to teach, is you see the rock of the gods, you say, on this rock I will build my church, and you see the temple that has the gates of hell, and you say, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So I think they were close enough to watch. How close they went, if they went to the city, have no idea. So what happens is he says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. I found that interesting also, that he never calls Simon the son of Jonah. Never mentions his father's name, but he does now. And I think that's very clearly picking up on the Jonah imagery of what Jonah didn't do. Because the whole point of Jonah is what you should be like as someone who is okay with God saving Gentiles and pagans. And so his whole point is, you get it, Peter, you're okay with this not being okay, but God's still wanting to save them. So blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, you are Petros, you are, that's a borrowed word from Greek that they would use in Hebrew, kind of like, I learned today, mutton in English. Mouton is French. It's a word we took because we didn't have a word for mutton, so we took the French word mouton and made it ours. Same word for Petros that they would use. So he says, you are Petros, which is you are bedrock. You are the bedrock. And on this Petros, I will build my church. So that is where the Roman Catholic view of Peter being the rock that the church was built on came from. And they're right. He is the rock the church was built on. Partially, the difference that you would have in a Protestant view is we don't believe there was apostolic succession. We don't believe that the authority of apostles exists still today outside of, there is no authority of apostles other than what they've left for us in the Bible. So, both, you have to admit that Peter was the rock the church was built on in Jerusalem. He was the one to go to the Gentiles. He was the one who, and he says, you're the one who will bind and loose. You are the one who will bind teaching and create and loose teaching. And whatever you bind here will be bound in heaven. If you make something a command here, it will be commanded in heaven. I will see it that is commanded by me, myself. Yeah, that's a powerful, and he says, I give you the keys to the kingdom. You have the authority to keep people out or to let people in. So if you say someone isn't saved, we would say, then they're not. And I will honor your discernment and wisdom. That is, he quite literally turns over the keys to the kingdom. It says, you will be in control once I ascend. He doesn't know that yet, but you will be in control. And then we see in Acts that's exactly what happens throughout Luke, and Peter is the kind of the head of the church in Jerusalem there for a bit. I tell you, Peter, and on this rock, you are rocky, is what he says. You are rocky. And on this, Petros, on this rock, you and the rock of the gods, I will build my church, my ecclesia, my gathering. It translates church, but the word is congregation, which is what Israel was called. They're a congregation of Israel. On this church, I will build Israel around myself. On you, Peter, I will build Israel around myself. Meaning Israel will be redefined by what I say, which is any Jew or Gentile who believes is grafted into Israel, and any person who doesn't believe, Jew or Gentile, is not in Israel. And that is the sense that, yeah, and then later in earlier in Matthew, that is what the sign of Jonah is. It's not just, we pick up on you will go into the belly of the fish for 3 days and resurrect. That is true, but what happens is Jonah comes out, he goes to Nineveh, a pagan region, and all of the Gentiles in Nineveh believe. That's the whole sign of Jonah. But the other sign of Jonah is that he comes out of Sheol, out of the water. Remember the water imagery, comes out of death, swallowed by an unclean animal, death, and then goes to a pagan city, and they all repent. But then Jonah, being Jewish, is angry, and he doesn't like that they repented. That is the whole sign of Jonah. And Jonah was not an accepted book at their time. They didn't all view it as canon, which is rather interesting. But Jesus evidently did, just by quoting that. So I love that what's going on there. Just imagine, one last thing before we end. Sorry, Matthew and Luke have these two really fascinating teachings in Mark 9. Matthew and Mark have these little different teachings. So basically what happens is, in all three accounts, Jesus says to them, whoever would come after me, take up your cross and die to yourself, essentially, and follow me. Meaning put your head on the guillotine, be ready to die, and come follow me. It's a packed statement. It's politically charged too, by saying, I wonder if they would have misheard it, meaning, hey, come join the rebellion, be willing to die like the zealots are willing to be crucified by the thousands, and come follow me. I'm sure some people misheard that. But he says, come, take up on the way of suffering like me, give up your life like me, and come follow me, because the whole beauty of the gospel is the way you gain abundant life is by losing it and giving up. If you let go of what life you think you're holding on to, God will replace it with something so much greater. In Mark's account, though, it says in chapter 8, verse 33, it says, but turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter. When Peter hears that Jesus says he has to suffer, Peter rebukes him, which is funny because he just says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, you've been given the keys of the kingdom. And then within a minute, he's saying, get behind me, Satan, and calling him a Satan. But then he says, you are being a hindrance to me, which is another word for rock. You are being a stone to me. Your name is Peter, which means rocky. You are the rock that I will build my church on. But right now, because you are preventing, or you are pushing back against me, saying I must die and resurrect, you are being a stumbling block instead of bedrock to me. So he's doing a word play on Peter's name, which is very funny. And Simon means shaky. And so sometimes he calls him Shimon, shaky, instead of Petros, bedrock. So I think that's so interesting. So by what name Jesus calls Simon or Peter, he's doing a wordplay sometimes on his name. Also later, he tries to walk on water and starts to sink like a rock is one way I remember it. I'm sure his friends gave him grief about that. In Mark, and I just want you to imagine this scene. Verse 33 says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Verse 34, and it says, "And calling the crowd to him with his disciples." So there's a crowd there that is not the disciples, but a different crowd. I mean, and just knowing what Caesarea Philippi is, are they Pharisees? Not a chance. You wouldn't go within 100 miles. I mean, you have to. Galilee's within 30 miles, but you wouldn't touch this place with a 10-foot pole, as it were. Was it the Sadducees? Not a chance. They're in Jerusalem. Was it the Zealots? No, they'd come in with swords trying to kill everybody. Was it the Essenes? They don't even come near other Jews. The Essenes thought the Pharisees were corrupt and, basically did everything they could to avoid obeying the law. No one would come to this. I mean, even Herodians, who are basically paganized Jews they didn't do idol worship, but they were Hellenistic Jews. They were culturally Jewish, but they didn't really care because they liked Herod and all that. They would not even come near this place. There was one rabbinic writing actually at the time that said, when the Messiah comes, the gates of Caesarea Philippi will be blown away, because there's no way that the Messiah and Caesarea Philippi could exist in the same world, because they viewed it as more pagan and disgusting than Sodom and Gomorrah. So when they thought that when the Messiah comes, he would come after the destruction of Caesarea Philippi, because there's no way they could be in the same world. So when he says calling the crowds to himself, I think, and at least I think that's what Mark's image is he's talking about the crowd at Caesarea Philippi. So he calls these crowds disgusting, I don't want to say disgusting people, they're made in God's image, but they're doing disgusting things. He calls them to himself and says, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. Whoever would lose his life, whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul?" And then he says something very interesting. Imagine you're 16 and you're following Jesus. I mean, these are places you wouldn't visit on the internet on your worst day, is Caesarea Philippi. I mean, bestiality and it's as rampantly pagan as you can think of. And he says, "For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation," remember Deuteronomy, "of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father and with his angels." So, I mean, just imagine the disciples saying, "Oh my, keep your voice down, Jesus. Do you realize, first of all, we're in Herod's territory. So for shouting that if you lose your life for the gospel's sake, that's a direct threat to Caesar's throne." But then just imagine shouting to these pagan people all these things: "Come after me, deny yourself, give up on your life, and follow me, and you'll find life." And then the disciples' reaction, and he says, "For whoever is ashamed of my words, I will be ashamed of you when you will see the Son of Man coming in glory." And I'll wrap this up. I thought we'd get to something tonight after this. I had no idea what I was thinking. I got through like a third of it. But someone I love and respect very much, a teacher to me, the way he taught this on accident was he was at this place and he shouted these words. And he realized that there was a group down below him. He had no idea he was there. And they're looking up at him like, who on earth does this guy think he is? He's shouting Jesus' words at Caesarea Philippi. And his people who were there learning were kind of like, this is super embarrassing. You're yelling at they're like Catholic. It was like a Catholic group doing a tour of Caesarea Philippi. And they're kind of looking at him like, who's this nut job? And he hit him of like, whoever is ashamed of my words, when he shouts that over Caesarea Philippi, does that make you want to curl up in a ball and hide your face? Or does that give you a fire in your heart that says, yes, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it? And that's, I think his teaching is, just that image, that metaphor again of what do gates do? Gates aren't, we always have this image, which is kind of weird of, we will stay strong while hell itself tries to attack. That is literally the opposite of the image that it is. And the gates, the defensive thing, gates are defensive, of hell will not prevail against my church, against my people. When they come for hell itself, nothing will stand against my people coming for you. And so I think what he's teaching there is not that we'll stay strong when culture seems to be shifting. I don't think that's his point, although I hope that's true. I think his point is these people, which, by the way, spoiler, a few hundred years later, this city was 95% Christian, and all the temples were torn down and was completely Christian later on. he says to these people, these are the people that will build my church. The gates of hell will be no more. I will come to these people. That is like, I mean, the way they lived was basically the entrance to the underworld. And I will come and build my church here with these kind of people. And they're like, you got to be kidding me. And he says, don't you ever be ashamed of my words and my way of doing things. So, I mean, that's just such a wonderful image of his teaching there. Let me make sure I didn't forget anything. Okay, I think I hit most of what I wanted to talk about. We did not get that far, and we didn't. There is a whole. You're gonna be so mad at me next week. There's a whole nother layer to this in Luke, at least. That's like a whole different layer that has seemingly nothing to do with everything we talked about tonight. But I'll give you a little taste, which I find is interesting, and hopefully it'll pique your interest a bit. Mount Hermon, in Jewish theology, in Jewish belief, based off of First Enoch, which is a book in the Apocrypha that we don't take as canon, but the early church did, that the Jews did, Essenes did, the early church did, early church fathers, Origen, Ignatius, Clement, all of them took it as canon, and later on, after the Reformation, they took it as not canon. It doesn't matter. But in First Enoch, they describe, and this was their Jewish belief, that Genesis 6, the sons of God, I don't want to call them angels, but we'll get to that. The sons of God coming down and having sexual relations with the daughters of man. To them, in their belief, that happened at Mount Hermon. That was the point in the world where corruption entered, in a sense. Of course, Garden of Eden, we'll get to that. But I love that there's a whole nother layer to this, that Jesus goes, okay, now, not only are we going to go up and do Sinai moment now, we're also going to show you how we're going to encounter the direct. I mean, we're taking this thing to the root. It is the corruption of the world. Not only is he the second Adam who undoes the effects of Adam and Eve's sin, but he is the one who goes up Mount Hermon and undoes, instead of, the sin going on with the fall of the angels, as it were, it is him hearing from God and him being vindicated and showing the kingdom coming where the world was, sin was brought into the world. So we'll talk about that next week, and that'll be pretty interesting stuff. But there's no better place to do that stuff than Wednesday class. It's probably not something that would make it into a Sunday sermon. It's very deep Jewish Second Temple apocalyptic stuff, but it's very interesting. So I talked for a really long time, but I really wanted to get through all that stuff, just all that in one moment, just this event at Caesarea Philippi. But if anyone has any questions or anything, I'd love to answer them. I forgot to add that the other city where this spring was, the entrance to the underworld, Dan, which was just a few miles away, was actually where King Jeroboam put the golden calf. I think it was Jeroboam. It was either him or Ahaz. But they put the golden calf there and says, hey, you can worship this instead of having to go to Jerusalem. And that happened, again, basically right next door in another fertility cult site where they worship the goat stuff again. It's so interesting to me.
Tyler, I've been reading through Ezekiel, and a lot of places it says Son of Man. It says the message came to me, the Lord said Son of Man. Is that any correlation to Son of Man where Jesus is speaking Son of Man?
I think so. There's sometimes it's just used to show someone's a person. So I think throughout Ezekiel, sometimes it's used that way, of just showing Ezekiel's just a man. And so God is saying to Ezekiel, hey guy, hey man, you're a human, go do these, go fulfill my mission. But I think there's definitely times in Ezekiel where it is used as that title. And what is weird is it's not a title. It's odd, but Jesus starts using it as a title. And I can't even think of an example in English where we would do that, other than like the Dark Knight, something like Batman. Like it's like, being a knight just means you're like a warrior, but the Dark Knight is like this very deep imagery for something much more than, it's Batman. It's all this deep stuff. So it's kind of like that. I'd have to look through the Ezekiel stuff more explicitly, but I know Daniel 7 would be the most clear.
Yeah, I just noticed that it mentions that practically in every chapter. I mean, Ezekiel's a dark book, but man, but it seems like every time he talks to him, he tells him, now the message from me, the Lord, Son of Man, are you ready to judge Jerusalem? And each chapter he says, Son of Man.
Yeah.
So I just thought that was, since I was just reading through, started reading through it, I thought, well, is there a correlation there or anything? Or is that
I'd have to go through that. That sounds, I mean, that the Son of Man judging Jerusalem certainly sounds like Jesus. Jesus puts himself in the shoes of the prophets multiple times. I would not be surprised if there are some pretty strong correlations there. So I'd have to definitely look at that.
Well, and he also says, like in 23, verse 23 of Ezekiel, it says, the message came from the Lord, Son of Man, once there were two sisters and daughters of the same mother. And it's making a correlation of, I think, Sodom and Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Samaria and Jerusalem. And he was making these two daughters, the daughter and the two sisters that were prostitutes, and he was comparing them or using them as an analogy of Sodom and Jerusalem. It's just really weird.
Yeah, because Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem's the capital of the southern kingdom. And so Ezekiel is prophesying in this time of separated kingdoms. And so a lot of the prophetic books are calling out either the north, so Samaria to symbolize the north, or the south, so Jerusalem to symbolize the south, or both. Yeah.
Well, I didn't want to go down a rabbit hole. I just knew that I've been reading through Ezekiel, and it's like every chapter he says that the Lord says to the Son of Man.
So I'll look into that. That sounds, I mean, it sounds very Jesus-like, so I'll look into that.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Anyone else got any questions or anything? You can always email me questions too, and I'll answer them at the beginning of next class if I can't answer them. But I do love questions. So anyway, go into the Caesarea Philippi of your world and don't be scared. I mean, I'll give you, I mean, just the rant for like 1 minute. I mean, I just love that. Sorry, now that people are gone, they won't get to hear this, but I mean, just like if the Christian community, we have such this problem, you know, it's always debated on social media and stuff, of course, but like, you know, you either judge someone or you love them. And like, that's such a false contradiction, right? That's those aren't mutually exclusive. And I think there's no better lived example of that than Jesus going to Caesarea Philippi. Because he didn't go there and say, hey guys, our church is going to be built on this rock. And the way we do that is by saying, hey, it's okay that you're living this lifestyle. He doesn't say that. He says, no, the gates of hell won't prevail. We're going to come blow up. He puts a time bomb beside their way of life. He says, the gates of hell will not prevail against my movement. But he doesn't condemn them with it, because in the next verse, the next section in Luke, they're asking to call down fire from heaven. And he says, no, you don't know what spirit you're of. The Son of Man didn't come to destroy people, but to save them. And I love that. I mean, it's just like engaging with people where they're at, understanding their sin, condemning their sin, but not condemning them along with it. You know, it's like, that's just such a beautiful example of Jesus does. And I love that he brings them to a disgusting place, but to show them that we're going to change this place. We're not going to abolish it. We're going to come in and not stay distant and change this place. So anyway, I think sometimes we get behind our gates of heaven and we keep everyone out. I'm not saying like church and stuff like that. I'm saying like, you know, we huddle up in our groups and we stay with our friends and we kind of distance ourselves from people with different lifestyle choices, whatever that may be, and we don't engage them out of fear of judgment. But I mean, Jesus literally yells to the crowd, hey, if you want to live, come die for me, or else you're going to die for real. And it's like, he wasn't scared of confrontation, but he also didn't condemn them. He condemned their way of life, and if they didn't chase him, then they would lose life eternally. So anyway, that's just an interesting lecture and application there. We'll get into more next week. Super excited for it. But anyway, we'll see everyone next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.